There are so many points of entry to that topic. For one thing, they're willfully ignoring very clear and more present danger all the time, with California burning and places flooding. And I've been to Venice, and the water was over my shoes, and that was 10 years ago. Now it's up to your calves.
This is Kathleen Gage, and I am thrilled beyond belief today to invite my expert author, and she's an expert on fuel, which is an interesting topic. Twyla Dell has written several books on the topic, and her most recent is Fueling Change. She's a Ph.D., so we're in for quite an educated conversation. Boy, is that the right way to say it? Oh, well, I just said it. So, Twyla, I want to welcome you to the show. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
You know, I'm thrilled that you're here, and we've known each other for a little while. You wrote this book called Fueling Change, and I have to tell you, since first meeting you, I have become so aware of my fuel usage and how much of the junk that I put into the atmosphere with every gallon of gas that I use. So let's start with, tell us about your background with being an expert around fuel, and then let's talk about the process of writing your book.
Well, I've been an environmental educator since 1990. Before that, I worked at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and then went on to create my own environmental leadership program. And I always started with the idea that we have to save the rainforest from burning and a number of other issues that were at hand at the time. And the fuel business says that's why the rainforest burning were such a problem, because they were both throwing up a lot of carbon dioxide and losing their ability to be the lungs of the world. And since 1990, by the way, they have been burning all this time. And I just heard on the news last week that half of the rainforest has been burned. So that's like losing one of the lungs of the world. And I wrote this book, Call of the Rainbow Warrior, which you may be able to see.
I can see it.
Call of the Rainbow Warrior, about in 1990. And it was about the rainforest burning, what happens to the animals in it. And it's a fable, but it is about that. And of course, you hope in 30 years that we're going to stop behaving so badly, but unfortunately, we have not.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I know there's a school of thought with some people, and I really want to address this, and then I want to talk about the process that you went through to, one, write the previous books you've written, but especially Fueling Change, because I have to tell you, I have been going through this, and this is a very heady book. I mean, it's got a lot of great content in it, but let's talk about the school of thought for the people who say there is no such thing as the environmental changes, the climate changes, things that are going on, and they say, oh, we're just making it up. Address that particular topic, if you would.
Well, there are so many points of entry to that topic. For one thing, they're willfully ignoring very clear and more present danger all the time, with California burning and places flooding. And I've been to Venice, and the water was over my shoes, and that was 10 years ago. Now it's up to your calves. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know what they want to call that. And I really can't spend time trying to convert those people, who are fewer and fewer, by the way. And Yale University did a study a few years back in which they asked people to rate themselves what their attitude was toward the global climate change. And you go from disinterested, disengaged, disaffected to cautious, very concerned, and then alarmed at the other end. And more people are moving to the alarmed phase, and certainly to the concerned phase, and fewer over at the disengaged and disaffected phase, because more and more proof is being created all the time. And, it's part political party, it's part willing it not to exist, part religion. And those people will just have to come around as they do. But what everybody can appreciate is that it has been well proven that burning a gallon of gasoline creates 20 pounds of carbon dioxide. Now, they can ignore that if they like, but like you, once you learn it, you think, wow, maybe I should do something about that, because this is the strongest gesture, the strongest gift that you can give to the planet is to burn less gasoline. And it is every time you pick up your car keys, yes, my car is this old, I have a key, and
we're not going to talk about old things at all.
Yeah. And so every time you put this key into the ignition, you are choosing to add to the problem. And on the news last night, they said that the sky, the atmosphere, has 50% more carbon dioxide in it than it did 100 years ago.
Oh,
50%. How much more do we want to put in it before we say, well, maybe that's not a good idea?
Right. Right. Well, let me ask you this on, with all the carbon dioxide in the environment, what is that doing to our health? I mean, I would say that I'm on the side of the alarmed, and it's like looking at whatever I can do to raise awareness. And that's why interviewing you is such a thrill to me, because I want people to be aware of what they're doing. So what does that do for our health, the respiratory problems? Is there an increase?
Well, the respiratory problems tend to be located in cities, and particularly those people who live close to the highway. They've always been targets for carbon monoxide and particulate breathing and so forth. Years ago in Los Angeles, when gang members died, those were usually teenage men, and they would autopsy them, and they'd find their lungs were like the lungs of smokers of 30 years. And that was just from living beside the freeway.
Wow.
So we've known about that for a long time, but we haven't had the will to do what we needed to do about it.
Well, which really leads into why you wrote the book, Fueling Change, which again, I encourage people, go to Amazon, you can get a copy. We'll have the link below, the direct link to get your copy of Fueling Change. Initially, you wrote this as a regional book, and now you're expanding it out where it's going to actually cover national issues and international issues. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, 10 years ago, I was working on gasoline. I graduated with a Ph.D. in environmental studies 10 years ago, and I wanted to convert my Ph.D. thesis into a book. And I did a lot of work around creating education programs for corporations and so forth, but it just wasn't something they were interested in 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to tell the story, and this book actually does that, tells the story of a city, it could be any city, and how they built one fuel after another. We built the village of Kansas in the 1820s with wood. It was at the very end of the wood age, and then coal came in. We built the city with coal and the railroads and all the things that came with coal. And then we built the suburbs with oil and gasoline. And that's how the city was built. And this has absolutely been overlooked by historians, the idea of fuel being the background to how we live. And if you will look at the backside of this, it says right here, history is simpler than we think. It's all about fuel all the time. And that's the point that the book makes. In the background of our lives is the kind and amount of fuel we have. And that creates the kind of culture we can afford to have. And throughout history, the rich people have had the fuel, the poor people have not had the fuel. And so now we are in a fuel transition from oil and gasoline to something else, if we will create it. And
so, let me, because this show is really about how did you write the book, but I could talk for hours on the environment and people's responsibility, and I know you could probably talk for days or weeks on this topic, but when you were writing the book, first of all, how long did it take you to write the book?
It took me about 10 years.
Okay.
6 years actively, and that's a lot of sitting in front of a computer and researching and putting it together and visualizing. And it wasn't until I got to the very end that I figured out how to end it, because I brought it up to the present moment, what the city of Kansas City is doing to reduce carbon dioxide use. They've reduced it by 13%, for instance. Cities are becoming very active in environmental air quality issues, particularly. And then I was shopping around for the final thought, and I came upon this very important piece of information about the single gallon of gasoline creating 20 pounds. And I thought, that is the piece that's missing, because we're just not emphasizing how much responsibility each of us has to use less gasoline. And that's the only way we're going to reverse global warming, and we have to do it through community action.
Right, right. So in the 10 years it took you to write the book, was there ever a point as an author where you said, this is just too much work, I just can't do this? Or were you always motivated?
No, it was very off and on. That's why it took 10 years. There were years when I didn't work on it. You know, I got discouraged, and I thought, what am I doing this for? And so at the end, I just decided to put a spurt on and make it happen. And that was in 2017, 2018. It came out in 2019. So there was a lot of time when it was just lying around like a rag.
So do you like what you see? If you do, go ahead and subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and leave your comments down below. What did you most like about this video? By subscribing, you get updates of future videos that I put out. And by liking, what happens is it helps for this video and all other videos to go out over YouTube land. And so I really need you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and leave your comments below. Now, back to the video.
But I really wanted to make this statement, because nothing like this has been done in environmental history. And when I was researching my thesis, there would be many books on energy, but nobody even defined energy, and nobody talked about fuel. And I thought, how can you write a book about energy and not define it? How can you write a book about that and not use the word fuel? So there's just a disconnect, a historical disconnect that's been going on there. And as an independent scholar, I didn't need to hold back. I didn't worry about tenure, and I just went ahead and did it.
So when somebody gets the book Fueling Change, what can they expect to really learn, and what are you hoping the book will do for people?
That's a great question. I hope they will see fuel come to the foreground, realize how it has shaped our lives and how we interact with it, because from 1820 onward, which was when the town of Kansas was beginning to be settled, we look at how the last moments of the wood age created this little village, and then the first harbingers of the new age of the steamboat coming up. And in 30 years, they went from one steamboat to 750 steamboats in a season. And that was mostly wood. But as they cleaned off the banks of the river of trees, they had to go to coal, which was the next fuel. And then the coal industry took over and created the railroads. And then you couldn't have a railroad without coal. You couldn't have coal without a railroad. So it was a very symbiotic relationship. And then when oil was discovered, there's a big story. I mean, there are big stories in there about all of this. And certainly when oil came on, they had no experience with a liquid fuel at all. And I mean, they were just confounded by it, because until they could get the oil to come out of the ground, they only filled little bottles of snake oil by skimming the oil off the pond. And then suddenly they were just drowning in oil, and how they had to borrow the barrels from the whaling industry to put it in, because they weren't prepared for it. And then they had to build pipelines, which they had never done. You know, there was just a lot of scrambling around to get oil to market, but they did it in 10 years because they realized what a rich source of wealth that was going to be and what it was going to do for the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so they really scrambled around to make that happen. Whereas coal had always been a more local, build a town, work the coal seam, pick up the town, move to the next one. My husband's father and grandfather worked in coal mines. And so we're well acquainted with that whole idea. At coal camp and picking up the houses and moving them to the next vein, it was much different from what oil did. And so for the first time in history, we had both wood and coal, and then we had wood, coal, and oil. And that just opened up the possibilities for human beings to live at a level that they had never known before, particularly when oil came in, and then gasoline. Gasoline has been, as I call her, the sculptress of our ways and means. And that's how we created our cities in the 20th century. You have a question? Because I have a story.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you see us running out of these resources? And if so, what comes next? And then I want to hear your story.
Okay, so no, there was a time that we thought we were running out of oil.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a myth that was perpetuated for about 50 years. And in fact, I have a book on my shelf called The End of Oil, and it was forecast that it was going to end on Thanksgiving Day in 2005. We were so sure. But guess what happened? Fracking. And fracking opened up the oil fields by drilling horizontally rather than vertically. And so we have oil all over ourselves again. I don't know how long that will last, but that was a revival that the public probably didn't really get. We all of a sudden knew we were talking about fracking. We weren't sure what it was, but that's what happened. They learned to drill horizontally, and there's a story behind that. It's interesting, but I won't take time to tell it. But it was a discovery, and that you could drill horizontally rather than just vertically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's the latest kind of technological breakthrough for oil.
Is that a good breakthrough, or does that have long-term effects?
Both. It is what it is. It opens up the last frontier of oil on the planet. It is a finite resource ultimately. Don't know how much is there, but it also has done a lot of damage to various regions.
Right. So what's the story you were going to tell us?
Okay. So we are in a fuel transition from gasoline to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to compare it to this moment in 1895 when we gave up horses. That's only a little over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We had used horses for 6,000 years. And we had built the present world with horses. But once the workers came into the city and there was such a density of population of humans, then the horses were densely populated as well. And each one of them left behind 20 pounds, ironically, of horse pucky a day, plus a quart of urine. And you have thousands of horses in the streets. It was just unbearable. And people really didn't know what to do about it. It's kind of like we are with carbon dioxide. What will we do? And the Europeans in 1888, they had created the internal combustion engine and the little car, and they were holding races, and they had taxis, and they had retail. Over here in the United States, 1895, 7 years later, we still had no cars, and we were just choking with horse pucky. So the Chicago Times-Herald decided to have sponsor an auto race, which they did. And it took 3 times for them to get enough cars together. There were only 4 manufacturers making a car a year in this country. And they finally got the field of 16 cars together. And there were the electrics, the steamers, and the gasoliners. And by the time they got the cars together, it was Thanksgiving. They started the 4th of July, and they couldn't get the field to fill. And meanwhile, a publisher in New York had created a magazine called The Horseless Age. And I just love that horseless age because he knew we were saying goodbye to something. He wasn't sure what we were saying hello to. And yet, it's just like us. We should be publishing a magazine called The Gasless Age, because we need to say goodbye to this very destructive carbon dioxide creating thing. And we should be saying hello to alternative fuels and methods of transportation and communication. So anyway, 1895, they ran the race and a gasoliner won. And the rest is history. And within 10 years, we were retiring horses right and left.
Wow.
And so we could do that in the next 10 years. This could be our age of letting go of gasoline and taking 10 years to replace it, and then moving on into the 21st century a whole new way.
So speaking of the next 10 years, with your book, Fueling Change, which, by the way, go to Amazon to get this book. We'll put the links below. And what is your web address? Where can people find you?
TwylaDell.com.
TwylaDell.com.
That's my website, and it tells about the book. It shows the murals. Have you seen the murals in the book with the 4 characters as they move along from wood to coal to
Trying
oil?
To find the page.
Well, the first one is on page 20, and that is the original cast of characters here.
Okay.
And that would be the farmer and his wife, the plantation owner and his wife, and she has the baby. They have a slave in the background, yes, because it was a slave state, and the white farmers brought in slaves. And in the background is the Osage Indian, who represents sustainable living, because the Osage Indians had lived in the area for 600 years, and yet when the Euro-American settlers arrived, it looked like it had never been touched.
Wow.
All the trees, all the meadows, you know, they knew how to live between earth and sky in a way that did not consume the place. But when the white settlers arrived, they started consuming. They cut down the trees, plowed the meadows, killed the buffalo. You know, that's the difference between consuming and sustainability.
Exactly. So over the next 10 years, where do you see your message going? Where do you see your influence going? And what's your dream for the information that you have to put out to market?
Well, I'm very pleased that I have such clarity of understanding of how to reverse global warming by using less gasoline. And that is the issue that we have to concentrate on. I want to create community groups. I want to create an app that helps people keep track of this and correspond with others, so that we can do a larger and larger and larger group of people who understand this is the way out of this. Because Time Magazine says this week, this is this week's Time Magazine, that we have maybe 11 years to avert the catastrophic effects of global warming.
Wow.
So we have to get busy. And I realize I'm a small voice on a big planet. I will do what I can. And hopefully gather people together who understand this and really go about reversing. We can if we do it now.
Right, right. Well, and there is an urgency. There's a, you know, we have to feel that panic. We have to feel that need to take action right away. And that's why I'm thrilled that I was able to have you on my show. And I really believe that, you know, you just getting out there and sharing the message near and far is the way to make the change.
That's all I can do.
Speaking of change, it's called Fueling Change by Twyla Dell. I encourage you, get this book, support her message, and I would even encourage you, reach out to Twyla if you have conferences coming up and you want Twyla to be a speaker. I've seen your YouTube videos. You're a funny speaker. You tell great stories, a little off color at times. That's cool. And imagine that. Oh, imagine that. But thank you so much. It's been delightful. And in closing, is there anything that you'd like to share with people about your message, about your book, about your life?
As far as I can tell, this is no joke. I mean, this is true science, and it's time to take it seriously. And it's the greatest adventure humanity can ever undertake. Let's do it.
Right on. Thank you so much, Twyla. This is
Thank
Kathleen
you,
Gage
Kathleen.
with Power Up for Profits, encouraging you, go out, do your part, use less fuel, and get the book Fueling Change. Have a great day.